Ever heard of the Vestal Scandal? It was this crazy event in ancient Rome that will literally blow your mind. The ancient Romans were superpowers of the world once. There are many reasons behind their dominance. They fought well, provided well, and ruled well. Despite that, they held beliefs and practices that wouldn't make much sense now. One of the many such insane beliefs was that in Vestal Virgins. Vestal Virgins, who were Roman most powerful priestesses, were put on trial for breaking their vow of chastity. Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia were the ones who got caught up in it, and let me tell you, things did not end well for them. It all went down in 115 to 113 BC, and it was all kinds of scandalous. Who were the Vestals? The Vestal Virgins were established in the early days of the Roman Republic, around the 7th century BCE. The Vestals were a group of priestesses in ancient Rome who tended to the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, home and family. They were chosen from among the elite of Roman society and held a high status and prestige. The priests in the ancient Roman Empire believed that the goddess Vesta protected their kingdom from any harm that may befall their empire. However, her protection would last as long as they lit a never-dying fire in her honor. And this fire protection could only be done by a group of virgins called the Vestal Virgins, who kept the fire burning for more than a millennium. They had to remain chaste, but not forever. For an investigation into Roman methods of handling ritual impurity, the priesthood of Vesta provides an excellent case study. Not only were the priestesses responsible for performing numerous rites that cleansed the city and people of pollution, but they were also capable of bringing pollution upon the Roman state by failing to maintain their own sacred status. The Vestals purified Rome, and Rome's purifiers had to be pure and perfect themselves. Candidates for the priesthood, all young girls between the ages of 6 and 10, had to be free from any physical defect, including speech impediment or hearing loss. The new priestess had to be patrima et matrima, a common ritual requirement in Roman religion, not just for Vestals. That meant both of the candidates' parents had to be alive. The most important aspect of a Vestal's purity was, of course, her virginity, which she was required to maintain for the 30 years of her service to the Roman people. After 30 years the virgin was allowed to marry, but only a few did. After their service to Rome had been completed, the priestesses would be freed from their vows, just in time to enjoy their midlife crises, but with all of the privileges that were associated with the Vestals. They lived in the house of the Vestal Virgins on the Roman Forum, near the Temple of Vesta. The house of the Vestals was a large complex that included the Vestals' living quarters, a garden, and several buildings for conducting their religious ceremonies and storing their sacred objects. The house of the Vestals was considered a sacred space and was off-limits to ordinary citizens, except during certain festivals and ceremonies. They wore a distinctive dress called a stola, which was made of white wool, and a white veil called a suffibulum. Their duties included tending the perpetual fire in the temple of Vesta, keeping their vow of chastity, fetching water from a sacred spring. Vesta would have no water from the city water supply system, preparing ritual food, caring for objects in the temple's inner sanctuary, and officiating at the Vestalia, June 7th to 15th, the period of public worship of Vesta. Failure to attend to their duties was punished by a beating, but the Vestal Virgins also enjoyed many honors and privileges not open to married or single women of equivalent social status, including emancipation from their father's rule and the ability to handle their own property. They were the women of the city. Beloved and closely watched by the people, as well as receiving invitations to the best and most important events in Rome. These ladies had premium seats at all the games, sitting close to the emperor, and were granted great privilege and prestige. However, like other famous and much-watched women throughout history, the Vestals also had their brushes with scandals. They were also required to take a vow of chastity for the duration of their 30-year service as a Vestal when they held the priesthood. The penalty for breaking this vow was death, and the execution was carried out in a special traditional way. The spilling of their blood had to be avoided. Instead, they were buried alive outside one of the city gates. The Romans believed that a crime against a Vestal's chastity came with serious negative consequences for the whole community. After all, one cannot so blatantly disregard the gods and remain unpunished. There could only be 6 of them, times 3. With all the prestige and all that came with being a virgin, you would think that all the women would have lined up to join the priestesshood. Unfortunately for them, the College of Vestals was very exclusive, and becoming a virgin was much harder than it would seem. Noble families would offer up their young daughters to the Vestal College, although in later years, the college would have to resort to lower-class families as the virginity fad began to die down. The order would admit 6 young girls to study the ways of the Vestals for 10 years. Afterward, they would perform the rites of Vesta for another 10 years and then train the newest batch of girls for their last 10 years of service. As such, there would never be more than 18 women in the Vestals at a time, which made them a rather scarce commodity. Marrying a current Vestal was a horrible mistake. Elagabalus was the 25th emperor of Rome. He was also a teenage boy most famous for fornicating across the capital, marrying 5 women and 2 men, and forcing the Senate to watch him dance for his Syrian sun god, which, in all honesty, is the least that the Senate deserves. Although Elagabalus preferred the company of his beefy charioteer, he forced Aquilia Severa, a Vestal, to marry him. He believed that this would have 2 benefits: the faiths of Rome and ancient Syria would be joined as one, and he and Aquilia would have godlike babies because the Vestals were clearly magical. For the people of Rome, this was unacceptable. The protectors of Vesta's flames were the Vestal Virgins, not the Vestal baby-makers. For the crime of rapturing a Vestal away from her duties, among other things, Elagabalus was quickly shown justice. In other terms, he was stabbed and decapitated before being thrown in the Tiber River. Breaking the rules as a Vestal was even worse. So much emphasis has been placed on the chastity and virtue of the Vestals. But even if the Romans thought otherwise, the priestesses were only human. Surely, they erred from their duties on occasion? Everybody needs their fill of Sunday fundery, after all. Unfortunately, the punishments for errant Vestals were ridiculously harsh. If the sacred fire were to go out, then the Vestal at fault would be whipped for making the goddess forsake the city. Allowing the sacred fire of Vesta to die out, suggesting that the goddess had withdrawn her protection from the city, was a serious offense and was punishable by scourging. Even worse was the punishment for breaking their vows of celibacy, the considerably bleaker sentence of death. The punishment for violating the oath of celibacy was to be buried alive in the Campus Celeratus, or Evil Fields, an underground chamber near the Colline Gate, with a few days of food and water. Of course, attempting to execute a Vestal Virgin for naughtiness would prove to be difficult as their sacred blood could not be spilled. "Easy solution," said the other priests, "we'll just bury them alive." This posed another problem, however. Roman law dictated that nobody could be buried within the city. "All right then," the rival priesthoods collectively murmured. "We'll build nice rooms underground, put a little bit of food down there, and then seal the room under several feet of dirt. That way, we're not burying the Vestals. We're just putting them in a chamber where they'll happen to die after a few days." The faithful of Rome then congratulated themselves on the sort of ingenuity that would make any politician swell with pride. If a Vestal Virgin was found to have broken her vow of chastity, she would be put on trial before the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. The trial was conducted in a special court, known as the Atrium Vesti, and could last for several days. This punishment was considered one of the most severe in Roman society and was reserved only for the most serious crimes. It was seen as a way of purifying the city and restoring the honor of the goddess Vesta. The execution of a Vestal Virgin was a rare event, and only a few cases were recorded in Roman history. However, the threat of punishment was enough to ensure that the Vestals remained faithful to their vows and devoted to their duties as keepers of the sacred flame. The Vestal Scandal. In December 114 BCE, not one, but 3 Vestals stood on trial at once, accused of this terrible crime. Their names were Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, all supposedly broke their sacred vow and, despite their religious duties, engaged in intimate relations with men. Basically, Aemilia was the one who started it all by getting down and dirty with this dude named Lucius Veturius. Then, she hooked up Licinia and Marcia with some of Lucius' friends. In the 1st century BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful Roman citizen, nearly lost everything when he was accused of being too intimate with a Vestal Virgin named Licinia. It was only when Crassus was brought to trial that his true motives emerged. It appeared that Licinia was the owner of a lovely villa in the suburbs which Crassus wished to have for himself at a low price. It was for this reason that Crassus was courting Licinia. This rather unfortunate reason saved both Crassus and Licinia, as he was promptly acquitted when it became clear that Crassus' wooing of the Vestal was motivated, not by lust, but by greed. Licinia herself might not have been too impressed hearing Crassus' motive in wooing her. Nevertheless, this very motive saved her from the fate of being buried alive in the Campus Celeratus, field of transgression. But things got exposed when a slave named Manius snitched on them. Aemilia was found guilty and sentenced to death by the Pontifex Maximus. The trial was a great scandal in contemporary Rome. Aemilia was found guilty and sentenced to death by the Pontifex Maximus Lucius Caecilius Metellus Dalmaticus, but Licinia and Marcia were both acquitted. This caused public outrage, cause Manius had testified that the sexual crimes of the Vestals had been an open secret among the aristocracy and people thought the elite were corrupt. So, the case was reopened the following year by the tribune Sextus Peduceus, who took the unusual step to transfer the case from the pontiff to Lucius Cassius Longinus Revilla, who was known for his severity. They, or at least Licinia, were defended by the orator Lucius Licinius Crassus. And both Licinia and Marcia were found guilty and sentenced to death by live burial. During the trial, several men were implicated as the alleged lovers of the Vestals and prosecuted. This involved several prominent people and the process has by some been interpreted as political. Among those men implicated were the orator Marcus Antonius, who was however acquitted. For men were judged guilty as charged for having been the lovers of the Vestals and sentenced to be buried alive at the Forum Boarium. After the trial, several rituals were conducted to clean the holy fire of Vesta from the pollution which was believed to have soiled it because of the crimes. The Vestal Scandal shows the severe consequences faced by those who broke the strict moral code of ancient Roman society, which held the Vestals to a higher standard of conduct than the rest of the population. Tuccia was another Vestal Virgin who lived in ancient Rome. According to legend, Tuccia was accused of breaking her vow of chastity and was put to the test by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. He ordered Tuccia to carry water from the Tiber River to the temple of Vesta in a sieve, which was thought to be impossible for anyone who was not a virgin. Tuccia prayed to Vesta for help and successfully completed the task without spilling a drop of water. The earliest Vestals at Alba Longa were said to have been whipped to death for having sex. The Roman king Tarquinius Priscus instituted the punishment of live burial, which he inflicted on the priestess Pinaria. However, whipping with rods sometimes preceded the immuration, as was done to Aemilia in 471 BCE. Her innocence was thus proven, and she was acquitted of the charges against her. End of the cult. The Vestal cult lasted for almost 1,000 years, but it eventually came to an end in the 4th century CE, with the rise of Christianity. As Christianity became the dominant religion in Rome, the Vestals lost their influence and power, and their duties were gradually transferred to Christian institutions. The last Vestal Virgin, Caelia Concordia, was believed to have died in the mid-4th century CE, marking the end of a unique and fascinating era in Roman history. Thanks for watching. Remember to support, please subscribe. Give us a comment below and let us know what you would like us to do in the next video.